Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. We're broadcasting live from Holiday, Utah. It's November 17th, 2017. My name is John DeLynn, and we're really excited about the topic that we have in store today. As some of you who follow Mormon Stories will know, we've been doing this series on what we're calling Neo-Apologetics. What I'm defining Neo-Apologetics as is sort of a new apologetic movement in Mormonism that's different from classic Mormon apologetics. So when you think of classic Mormon apologetics, think of sort of Hugh Nibley, think of Daniel Peterson, think of Brian Hales, Fair and Farms, and the Maxwell Institute historically before the changes of late. And it's basically attempts to defend Mormonism through science. Sometimes some would say pseudoscience or not very high quality science. It's the reliance on sometimes ad hominem attacks to attack anyone who's willing to question the church. And it's sort of apologetics that either gaslights or invalidates the doubting perspective. And we'll just call that classic apologetics. Please check out our past two Mormon Stories episodes to understand that a little bit better. We've been doing those with Dan Witherspoon of Mormon Matters podcast, and we hope to have him back for more analysis of that. But we're contrasting that with what we're calling Neo-Apologetics. You can think of Neo-Apologetics as the work of Patrick Mason with his book Planted, with Terryl and Fiona Givens, with Richard Bushman, which is very much more a pastoral approach. There's a lot of love, a lot of empathy for doubters and questioners. And it's not so much an attempt to respond to challenges of the church's truth claims directly through the use of science. There's a heavy reliance on humanities and on just almost poetry and theology to sort of see if we can not only help people stay in the church, but also provide people with ways to see the church differently. And in no arena, I think, has Neo-Apologetics sort of been more influential in the church than this sort of dynamic of Terryl and Fiona Givens traveling around the world, literally, paid for by an organization that at one time was called the Temple Observatory Group, I think they were called, which were a group of wealthy Mormons who pooled money to pay for the Givens to fly all over the world and to do these types of workshops and retreats. Temple Observatory Group, I think was their name. And so they've done this. And to some extent, it's really kind of a little bit secretive and behind the scenes. But I think they might object to that characterization because I think in some cases, these firesides have been advertised more broadly and just kind of open to the public. And so what we're doing right now is we're actually going to bring on to Mormon Stories Podcast two individuals who recently attended one of these Terryl and Fiona Givens firesides. And the fireside that was held in Arizona, I believe, and we'll get more details about it, the fireside was held to discuss the new book that the Givens have come out with. The book is called The Christ Who Heals, which is a follow-up to The God Who Weeps, which again is a very poetic kind of humanities sort of device. The God Who Heals, The Christ Who Weeps. It almost sounds like poetry. And that's sort of what we're talking about here. They were in Arizona at a fireside to promote their book. And the two individuals who we have on board talking to us today were two men who were actually in attendance. And so the two men that we have with us to discuss this are Scott Turley and Carey. Carey, how do I pronounce your last name?
Foushee.
Foushee.
Like Foushee, but Foushee, yeah.
Yeah, and we're just going to talk about what the Givens are saying, what they're teaching, and kind of get Scott and Carey's reactions to what the Givens are teaching personally, what it means to them. And then we're going to try and have a little bit of a conversation about what it all means or does it mean to Mormonism in the 21st century? So with that, what I want to do is welcome both Scott and Carey to Mormon Stories for the first time. And I want to invite each of them to briefly kind of introduce themselves to our audience. So Scott Turley, would you mind going first and introducing yourself to our audience?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me on. My name is Scott. I have been a lifelong member of the church. The Turley name goes back all the way back to Joseph Smith. I grew up in Arizona, and I kind of gotten into this world of liberal Mormonism. I'm not quite sure how long ago now, but my sister actually sent me a link to your podcast, John, several years ago, and she had kind of gotten introduced to it just before that, and it just kind of got me on this journey of I just kept listening, and I especially enjoyed some of the these Neo-Apologetic interviews that using the term you're using, especially the Bushman interviews, the Giddens interviews, Adam Miller. Those were the ones that really spoke to me and kind of really got me firmly in this kind of world of liberal Mormonism, and kind of in that journey, it kind of led me to the Facebook groups. And so I was in, I think, some of the Mormon Stories Facebook groups for a while, and eventually a Thoughtful Faith group came up, and I joined that, and actually I've been the moderator for that group now for the past 3 or 4 years, I believe. So yeah, that's pretty much kind of a brief summary of how we've gotten into this kind of part of Mormonism. But I've loved it. I really love this kind of light over here in this corner of Mormonism with the Givens and Bushmans and Adam Miller and some of the other kind of take on Mormonism. It really speaks to me. So I'm happy to be here and talk about that.
So happy to have you here. And I just can't say how important I believe the work of the A Thoughtful Faith Facebook group is. You and Jerry Lee and Mark Crago and Dan and everyone else who participates. Who are some of the other mods?
John Grimes.
That are okay being mentioned public, I should say.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure about that. But yeah, we have a handful. We've had some recent ones that are doing a lot of good work. So yeah, I'm not sure who'd mind being made public. So I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's how I learned about this Fireside.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Scott, it's great to have you. Carey, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
Yep. Carey Foushee, living here in Mesa, Arizona. I go back to Mormon Stories. About 7 years ago, listening to your podcast. I was even there was when Mormon Stories used to have the little local groups. I was in the Phoenix Mormon Stories book club, and that was a pretty vibrant thing going on. We had book clubs and played basketball together at the church. We did lots of different things as a group for a long time, and I was really involved in the Facebook and all those online groups for a while. I think over the last maybe year or two, I've kind of just my Facebook time and Thoughtful Faith. I am a member of that, but I haven't really been as participant on it. I kind of just come in and come out. So, but I've definitely been still involved in the Mormon studies or the what Scott's called Mormon liberalism. I've been, reading the books of the Givens, the Bushmen, Joe Spencer, those, I listen to a lot of different podcasts. I still am a pretty avid podcast listener. I don't consider myself a scholar in the Mormon studies thing, but I do like to read and participate that as just as a informed person. And, I still am a active member of the church and going, and that's me.
All right. Well, it's a real honor to have you both. I am going to just mention, because it's an important part of our values here in the Open Stories Foundation and Mormon Stories. We don't like it that there's just three men here and no women. And we did arrange to have Renee Bruner van Oustal join us, because she was one of the main people, as I understand it, to help organize this event, and was also a participant. But we, recording time came and we haven't heard from Renee. So we're hoping she can still join us. But we also want you to know that for us, it's suboptimal to not have a woman joining us. And honestly, if there's a woman who's listening right now who attended this event and who wants to participate in this conversation, I would literally share with you the link. You can join us, and we would love to have you. So just message me on Facebook if you are a woman who attended this event and wants to participate in the conversation. Again, we would just love to have you. All right. So, Scott, would you be the best person to kind of tell us what you know about how this event came to be and kind of what it was, just to give listeners a sense for what's going on?
Yeah, I heard you talk about that organization that kind of organizes these firesides. I'm not sure that was the case here.
Okay, the Temple Observatory Group, yeah.
Right. My understanding was the Givenses were in Arizona anyway. There was a women's conference that happened a week earlier, so they were in town. That ward, I think they had a member that was in the Givenses' home ward back in Virginia at one point. And so they had a connection, and so they invited them over to their building to do this fireside. It was on a Friday evening, and it was made public. I knew some people in that ward, and I saw them advertise it on their Facebook page, and so I arranged it to head on out there. And so that's my understanding how it came about.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, tell us more about it.
Okay, yeah. So basically, they Fiona and Terryl Givens were both leading it, and Fiona took the first half, and Terryl took the second. And I didn't even know about the book, so I just kind of came in blind to that. But just to kind of talk about the main kind of topics that were described, and basically this is going to be through my own filter, so hopefully it's accurate, but it's what kind of struck me. The main thing was they were really focused on what Joseph Smith was trying to do, especially in the context back then of the world. The United States at the time was very steeped in this Protestantism, and it was very steeped in Adam, the original sin, and salvation, Christ saving us from our sins, and the God who kind of condemns us, and the Jesus who advocates for our sins to this God who advocates. And he was really pushing up against that kind of view of God in Christ. And especially really point out that Joseph Smith was doing the same thing. So rather than a Jesus who saves us from our sins, it's a Christ who heals us from our woundedness. And rather than a God who condemns us and judges us, it's a God who mourns with us and a God who weeps, right? And rather than us having the sinful, like being born into a sinful state, we're actually born into a state of woundedness. And that our job here it's not Adam, kind of the event of Adam wasn't a fall, but rather an opportunity to ascend, right? We come into this life to ascend back to God. So it's this idea of coming from this wounded state and finding Christ, and through the process of our lives, finding wholeness, which was his kind of replacement for perfection. So rather than be therefore perfect, be therefore whole through a Christ that heals. And that kind of paradigm shift, I just found really beautiful and resonant. So those were the main kind of thesis. And he spent a lot of time going back and really digging out the scriptures that kind of prove this point in the Pearl of Great Price and Doctrine and Covenants, and looking at the original Greek of the New Testament, and really digging out kind of how kind of proving this thesis out. So that was the main summary of the Fireside that I got out of it.
Talk about what they said about baptism, what it was and what it wasn't.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a good point. So commonly we view baptism as a remission of sins. So if life isn't necessarily about receiving forgiveness of sin, but being made whole from woundedness, so baptism similarly is not necessarily remission of sins, but it's an adoption into the body of Christ, and then taking a covenant to being a collaborative partner with Christ and God to help each other receive that comfort. So it's going back to Alma of making a covenant to mourn with those who mourn, comfort those who stand in need of comfort, and to lift each other's burdens. And that's really what baptism is about. It's an adoption into the family of Christ. and to make a covenant to help each other in a collaboration with God to heal each other from our wounded state. So again, that was a really important point that they made. So, yeah.
And then and I'm just going through the bullets you wrote in the A
Right.
Thoughtful Faith group.
Right.
Talk about the judgment and what the judgment is and isn't according to the Givens.
Right. Yeah. So I'm trying to remember exactly. So yeah, the main point is
I'll read what you wrote. Do you want me to read what you wrote?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks.
They talked about judgment as an event to see oneself clearly so that we can be healed.
Yes.
Not so much as as like you're being judged with the big weight.
Right.
Of like, did you have enough sins or enough good things, and counterbalancing that.
Yeah. It's to bring out, it's to allow ourselves to be aware of ourselves and to bring out these dark places so that we can be, like you said, we can be healed. And a big part of that is, it's not like we're condemned to one kingdom. And that was another point that came up. This is a chance where we can kind of progress through the eternities to reunite with God, right? And that's universally available to everybody. So and so the judgment is a time of healing, and a time of unification, it's a time of finding union. Yeah.
It almost sounds like he's saying it's not sifting the wheat from the tares. It's not about exclusion.
Right.
Is that the sense you're basically conveying?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Okay. And then you mentioned the 3 degrees of glory.
Right.
And historically, maybe many of us were taught there's no progression between kingdoms, right?
Right.
What were they saying about the 3 degrees of glory and progression?
Yeah, I mean, he referenced Joseph Smith's brother, Alvin, who died really young. And he said that Joseph Smith had this vision of seeing him in the terrestrial kingdom at one point, and then later seeing another vision of him in the celestial kingdom. And so the point was that there is this progression. Like we're not stuck in one kingdom, right? It's the opportunity to progress from kingdom to kingdom. And this was a little bit controversial in that Facebook post, but what I got out of it was, this was a lot of general authorities were talking along these lines back pre-1950s, but it was after Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce R. McConkie. And I kind of, in my head, was thinking correlation when they really tightened the screws and became more turned Mormonism and a lot more Protestant. And we've kind of lost some of that, is what I heard them say.
So in some ways, he's basically reaching into our historical past,
right,
to find maybe more conciliatory doctrines so that we can feel comfortable about shifting from where we are now. It's not so much a divergence, but a return to what many have taught previously.
Oh yeah, I jump in there. That I think that's Terryl Given's work. In his other books too, Wrestling the Angel and stuff. He doesn't just go back to the Mormon restoration. He's going back to the early church.
Yeah,
He's always pulling on those threads, but there are always just seeds out there. It's not, there's probably a lot of seeds. So there's probably a lot of different ways you can do that, but that's his work, right? He kind of goes in there and he's like, and I think even in I haven't read their new book, but they alluded to it that, they went and looked at the path that the Western and the Eastern Christian churches take. And they're saying, we're seeing all this emphasis that Mormonism kind of more aligns with in the Eastern. Part of the thing, is that the restoration isn't just a restoration of this authority power. They're trying to emphasize the restoration of our ideas, of our theology.
Right.
And in some ways, I don't know that that's as sexy of an idea. The place wasn't very packed. I mean, there was probably a quarter of the chapel filled. My brother and
quarter. So like 50 people, 800 people.
Yeah. 50 to 60 people.
Yeah.
So you could kind of spread out wherever you wanted. I mean, there was maybe there were 60, 70 people, maybe, my guess is, but it was not full. I went in there like, it's just going to be packed, because for me, it's like, the Givens are coming, and I drove 35 minutes, it's in Queen Creek and I'm in Mesa. So, I drove 35 minutes to go see it. And I know Scott comes from Tempe, so he's coming that far too. My brother is in the stake. My sister's in that stake. They hadn't even heard of it.
Yeah. Okay. So that's interesting. Well, before we talk about all that, Carey, what do you want to add? You attended. So what do you want to add to what you heard the Gibbonses teach that you found meaningful or noteworthy?
It wasn't most. Some of it wasn't new to me, like the eternal progression through the kingdoms wasn't new to me. But I brought somebody with me that lives right by me, and it was completely new to him. So I could talk about that later about his kind of.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. But anything else just about what they said that Scott didn't cover that you found noteworthy?
One thing too is a lot of what they're redefining is that idea of, instead of sin, it's more about weakness, right? It's kind of, instead of they're seeing some of, like they even mentioned Royal Skousen, some of the new interpretations, or Royal Skousen has been tracking the different translations of the Book of Mormon, the different versions of it, and going back to the original manuscript. And so sometimes there's word changing, and he brought that up, that we seem to always kind of want to redefine things as sin rather than leaving these words as woundedness or weakness. But it's a very fine theological point, the difference, in some sense. I think to the average Chapel Mormon, you're just gonna be like, well, it doesn't make any difference. But they're kind of building the ideas that they're talking about. It does make a difference. It does have impact, and that's what they seem to be focusing on. I almost felt like it was a restoration of the restoration, right? You're kind of going back and trying to restore those original ideas and say, this stuff matters. That we don't believe in original sin. I don't know that they brought that up in the Fireside, but it is in his book, and he'll focus on what that even means. And so they've got to do education first to explain what that means before you can say, why is it that we don't believe in it? And I think what the Gibbons are getting to is like these distinctions, these theological distinctions in early Mormonism are important, and we need to kind of emphasize those again.
I love it. Okay. So let's do this. Scott, tell us what dog you have in this hunt, so to speak. Can you talk to us about whatever you're comfortable sharing about your personal approach to Mormonism, or your framework within Mormonism, and what the Gibbons' work means to you personally?
Yeah, I mean,
even a little bit about your story.
Sure. No, I mean, I grew up in a fairly marginal family in terms of just a dad who had trouble keeping a job, parents who struggled in a lot of different ways. And they didn't have a lot of friends. They liked to just stay home. They struggled socially. And the church for them meant everything, right? They went to every church activity. We had a lot of support from the ward in terms of financial support. They were all in on home teaching and visiting teaching, but it was kind of a way of living Mormonism that was, I kind of looking back, especially, it was a little bit dead for them. I mean, it was good in that it gave him some structure, it gave him some survival, and it gave him a network. But it was just about, if I get my home teaching done, if I go to church every Sunday, I'm done. I made it, right? That's salvation, right? I baptized all 4 of my kids. I got my son to the priesthood, and they kind of went through all the check boxes, right? So that's kind of how I grew up, is that for them, as long as they did those things, they were good. And that's all they did, right? And kind of growing up, and I looked at the mission too, and I struggled a lot as a kid. It was tough. I had a lot of my own issues, depression. I had a lot of anxiety, and a lot of that too. I could see Mormonism at the time as both kind of a salvation, as well as it was like saving me from a lot of different things. But it was also like brutal in that I constantly felt like I was not good enough. I constantly felt like the weight of sin, right, was just a presence in my life. And I never felt good enough. I never felt worthy. I always I took the sacrament and I passed it and blessed it, but I never felt like I was doing it worthily. And I didn't have trust. I didn't have good relationships with bishops. I think they all meant well, but it was kind of a scary, this judge in Israel kind of concept. It was hard for me at the time. But the mission, I felt like the mission was a way for me to really get my life together. And for me, it was life-changing. And I came back on fire, and I was all in on Mormonism. But I have influences. I've had a lot of influences outside of the church. And the main thing for me, just kind of growing up, is I had a lot of good things and bad things in Mormonism in my life. But I had a lot of really good things and maybe not so good things outside of Mormonism. I've always saw these lights outside. So my two older sisters were very steeped in feminism, and they were very liberal from early on. They both went up to BYU and really struggled from an early age, much earlier than I did, with Mormonism, very upfront. But they were very much into the arts, and they were getting me exposure, getting me to theater, to art and music and different things. And there was this whole world that I saw outside of Mormonism that I found beautiful and full of lights. So I always had that. And so that's kind of when I was talking about, and so my sister sent me a link to Mormon Stories. And so I started listening, and I just started seeing these perspectives from anti-Mormon folks, or from nuanced Mormon folks, or liberal Mormons for feminism. And, your world starts expanding, your thought process starts expanding. So for me, it wasn't, so there was a mix. There was a light out that I was just following, this light. But it was also, there's certain things in my life it just wasn't, Mormonism wasn't always the solution for, and I needed to find different ways to frame it. I struggled a lot just being that whole perfectionism kind of thing, right? Or, okay, I see bishops, I see stake presidents, I want to be like them. I got to home teach every month. I got to do my calling 110%. And it was just really stressful. And anxiety and stress, that's kind of part of my personality to begin with. And so just when I saw these other approaches, hey, I can relax. There's grace, without a Miller, there's grace. There's, by the way, Joseph Smith had his own flaws, right? He had his own mistakes. So these great people I've been putting up on a pedestal aren't always that great either. So, right, I can kind of take it easy on myself. So, it's kind of a complicated story, but that's the essence of it. And so anytime when I hear a message like the Givens is, a Christ who heals, that just speaks to me at a deep level. And it allows me to really hey, this is Mormonism. This is how Mormonism really could and should be. And this is how I can live it, right, in my personal life. And this is how I can teach it to my kids as well. So I think that's basically the essence of it.
So it sounds like you've had a textured perspective to the church, like probably all of us have in different ways, but that at different times you've either questioned or struggled or not felt completely edified by what Mormon doctrine or theology or practice has had to offer. And so for you, the Givenses sort of present a brand or a form or a look at Mormonism that feels more hopeful, that feels more healing, that is more edifying to you than maybe Bruce R. McConkie, Joseph Fielding Smith correlated CES historical Mormonism. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. And so for you, are the Givens an important part of what allows you to kind of feel good about staying engaged with the church?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot more to it, but definitely this is a brand of Mormonism that I really love. I think I've never really contemplated leaving the church, right? So my roots in it.
You've never had a faith crisis that challenged your commitment to the church?
No. I mean, because like I said, there's a lot of parts of Mormonism that have been life-saving. And there's a lot of the stuff that the Givens are bringing up, I found in other ways, right? Just that whole, just this network, this community, this opportunity to really engage. And some of this stuff came up too in their crucible of doubt, right? Of just kind of be an opportunity to serve others as other people served me when I was a kid, kind of struggling, because there were people in my life through my wards and the young men presidents and seminary teachers. And like I said, there was a mixed bag. There were some things that were kind of brutal, but on the whole, I think I gained a lot more out of it than was harmful. So
got it. Okay. So that's great. Carey, what's your dog in the hunt?
Yeah, I mean, I resonate a lot with what Scott's saying. One interesting thing, the friend I brought, he was like, after me and him were talking, and he was like saying, "You mean you can progress through the kingdoms?" It's like, I'm like, the next day I was talking to him, I said, "You'd never heard that before?" And he's like, "No." He went in and he was talking with his bishop apparently, and he went and told his bishop, and he was like, the bishop's like, "Yeah, we really don't know what goes on, what exactly it's going to be like, in the afterlife or whatever." And so he felt a little, permission to kind of believe in that idea. And I was like, "You never even heard that?" Or I sometimes forget, different perspectives, how different they can be. And then he said to me, "What? How do you know what is true? How do I know what to believe? If I can believe that versus believe that, because so some of it becomes about an authority thing." And I think the Givens, because they approach it through an academic kind of lens, right? They're going into research. They're telling you what the translation of this Greek meant, in the original thing. And they do their research, and they're talking about their early church fathers and everything. So they're giving you, some kind of ground to base these ideas on. But in the end, it's still about authority, whether you're willing to listen to.
Yeah. And we're going to cover that, but I'm just trying to get a sense for why you care, you personally. Why does Carey care? Is this just fun, intellectual? Are you in the church? No. Are you trying to find reasons to stay? Is their work meaningfully personally to you? If so, why?
Well, because I've come to a point where I don't need, I don't have to have it all defined for me, right? But I am staying, and I am trying to make sense of Mormonism in my real life, and make it help me with my life and my wife and my kids, and going to church and dealing with things. And there came a point in time where, the very, classic story, rigid story, kind of orthodoxy kind of broke, right? And I was left almost with nothing. And so I started to become aware that there were other people with other ideas, from all kinds of different, I wasn't aware of Sunstone, of dialogue, of these, and now there's even more, right? The Maxwell Institute, all these different kinds of ideas and reading. And it's like when I read Rough Stone Rolling, I kind of fell in love with Joseph Smith again. But I got a sense of his vision. And yet there were times where I still kind of felt like there were things where I'm like, well, he's clearly, crazy here, or this is just the normal, weaknesses of people. I had judgments of him, but I also was inspired, and that's how I've just kept going. So this kind of thing for me is a way to, it's a watering hole. It's a way to kind of go and, I go to these things occasionally and be with people that are like-minded, that are both, involved in Mormonism, but it doesn't have to be that the traditional understanding. They're willing to entertain new ideas. So that's, I go because it uplifts me, and I'm interested in learning. I'm interested in learning about history and
Got it.
theology.
Okay, so in some sense, it's similar. It's similar to Scott. You're looking for you're trying to hang on. You're hanging on. You're committed. You're in at some level, and you're looking for additional perspective or nourishment that can help you feel better about your engagement. Right.
Right. And that would be why I go home teaching. That's why I go to church, is in a sense, I mean, the same answer to all of those things. I don't really do things out of, I'm obligated, otherwise I'm going to, burn, or I do it out of sense of fear. I'm probably, and like I say, I'm not that awesome, right? I probably still do some things out of fear or trying to please others, sure, or things, sure, but relatively speaking, it's a lot less. Mostly what I'm doing in serving, it feels more authentic to me. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Let me just say as a side note that I've tried multiple times over the past couple of years to get the Givens to come on Mormon Stories, and they continue to decline. So I'm only saying that not to criticize them, but to let people know that it may be weird that we're talking about their firesides and their books and they're not here. For now, it's because I can't get them to come on. Now, I did write Fiona back in 2015 and asked her if she'd come on Mormon Stories. And she said something interesting. She said, our primary concern is the possible misperception that we may be setting ourselves up as faith crisis gurus, which we most certainly are not. Also, their publicist apparently has me on an email list. And when they publicized this new book, I volunteered to interview them because their publicist reached out to me. And of course, when I said, yeah, I'll do it, bring them on, I've heard nothing back yet. So I hope the Givens will be willing to come back on Mormon Stories. We feel like we not only have a lot of people that could benefit from what they have to say or who care about what they have to say, but also we feel like we've kind of helped them get visibility. And we would just appreciate it if they didn't just kind of, now that they're doing what they're doing, kind of ignore and forget us. But I just wanted to make sure everyone understands that I want the Givens here speaking for themselves, and I'm going to do everything I can to make that happen. But having said that, do either of you have a reaction to this idea that Fiona would say that she doesn't want a perception that they're setting themselves up as faith crisis gurus? My reaction was, isn't that exactly what they are? Scott, what would your reaction be to that?
I'm not sure. I definitely saw the Crucible of Doubt as that, for sure. I kind of feel like this book and this Fireside was more directed at the church wholly. Like, hey, this is
theology gurus, right?
Yeah,
theology gurus.
Yes. Like they're saying, they're pulling out these really beautiful parts of Mormonism with the idea of trying to get the broader church community to really respond, I think. But for sure, the Crucible of Doubt was directed right toward faith crisis.
Okay.
Folks. Yeah.
So this is more a theological act than a faith crisis act.
I mean, that's my interpretation.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that matters. You were there, right?
Right.
And you're someone who cares. Carey, do you have anything to add or not?
No, I guess I agree again with Scott.
Okay. That's fine. Yeah. That's fine. All right. So let's get into some of the issues or concerns that people have expressed. These are going to be obvious things, and they're going to be things that others are going to know. We want to invite anyone who's listening live to please post your questions or comments about what they've heard so far. I'll just read a couple comments that have been listed so far. So Carey writes, and these are just reactions to what you two gentlemen have already said. So Kathleen wrote the single word spin. I don't want you to respond to that yet, but I want to just start giving what some of the listeners have said so that we can have them in our minds as we talk about this. So Kathleen wrote spin. I'm guessing that she's saying that the Givenses are trying to spin Mormonism. Carey wrote, Mormonism promotes perfection and routine, which breeds depression. So I think Kiersey's responding, Scott, to some of the things that you wrote about how perfectionism can get you down, and the high standards and maybe even the theology that some of the more harsh or rigid apostles may have advanced over the years can lead people just to feel really down. And it sounds like the Givenses are trying to promote a theology and a gospel that's more hopeful, that's more healing, to make people feel great about the gospel instead of just beat down and depressed about the gospel. And I'm guessing that, you've already said, Scott, that that's kind of what it means to you, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Clark wrote, when my shelf broke and the prophet pedestal came down, so did that perfection and guilt complex. So Clark is basically echoing what you, Scott, and what Kiersey have also said. David writes, I fully support the effort to change institutional Mormonism, but I really struggle with the message that the Givenses and others push. To me, it feels they are representing a version of Mormonism that it's simply not. The Givenses' version of Mormonism is often foreign to what is being taught by the 12. Okay, so let's jump into that really quick. So Carey, we'll start with you this time so you're not always me tooing Scott. Shannon wrote on Facebook, I love these thoughts and ideas, if only the quorum of the 12 taught the same. So I have two questions for Carey and then Scott. Who are the Givenses to be theologizing, right? What gives them authority and power to even think that they can be opining on theology? And I don't mean that in a challenging, negative way. I mean, I think there's a healthy discussion about where theology comes from and whose right is it to theologize, right? So don't take this as me questioning them or criticizing them. I think it's a valid question. Who are the Givenses to be theologizing? And if this isn't coming from the 12, does it matter? Carey, what's your reaction? And then we'll get Scott's.
I mean, that's kind of what I was alluding to with my friend too, is kind of, it's about authority, and
what's about authority?
Right. Yeah. The theology or versus doctrine. And I think that's kind of where we've, even the Givens at the Fireside at the end, they had a Q&A, and he did say, what we're teaching here, in response to somebody asking a question is, we don't speak with authority. They're not trying to deliver it with, thus saith the Lord or something like that. It's about persuasion. Either you're going to listen and, their arguments and go and verify them, in terms of it's more of an academic type of situation. You're either going to be persuaded by their arguments and their evidence, or you're not. And the hard thing with, coming out of a different paradigm of Mormonism is you're normally always, this is what I took out of it. And I will say that, lots of people take different things out of even the church. There's not just one version of things, but there do seem to be prominent versions that we all kind of glum to, and I feel like I was a quote unquote victim of that too. I grew up with things now that I look back on and say, oh man, maybe that's why that hurt me in my life, and maybe why that made me so unhappy. I'm glad I've learned something new and better about it now.
So it sounds like you're saying theology can be this marketplace of ideas where people shouldn't speak with authority because they'll get in trouble. But why can't the church be this place where people have different private perspectives about theology, and those who like and benefit from it can enjoy it, and those who don't like or benefit from it can believe what they want to believe? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that's actually what the church is, to some extent.
Okay.
I think there is a part of that going on. People don't feel quite as open and free about that. I think, if you go back correlation, or just that, what happened. I mean, they're not writing books on the New Testament anymore. I do think there's starting to be a separation between the scholars and the general authorities, the administrators of the church. And I know they still, have messages to speak about the gospel and Christ and stuff like that, but I do see a difference in
Who's not writing books on Christ or on?
Well, unlike Jesus the Christ, like Talmage or Mormon Doctrine, we're not seeing those type of books come out from the 12. We're seeing those kind of come out through.
Okay. All right.
Through BYU channels, through more of experts.
Got it. Scott, what's your reaction to the questions? Who are the Givenses to be theologizing, and does it matter if it's not coming through the 12?
Yeah, I mean, like Carey said, they were upfront with that in the Fireside. They said, "Hey, we don't speak for the church. These are our opinions only." And you hear people say that all, and I think that's very common too. You do hear people say, "Hey," in Sunday school, say, "Hey, this is a doctrine according to me," right? You hear those kind of disqualifiers quite often. But I will say though, there's a lot of this stuff I would challenge is very core to the gospel, like a Christ who heals. That whole concept of a healing Christ, I've heard a lot.
Sure.
On the local level, especially, where bishops talk about, hey, you can use grace and the atonement to heal you from your whatever pain or damage. I think that's very core to the gospel. And I mean, there are some things that I haven't heard, officially, especially progression through kingdoms. I think that was fairly controversial.
My brother was taught that doctrine by his mission president back in the mid 80s. But it was taught as kind of the secret thing that only those in the know could talk about. And you almost got this sense that there were brethren who believed it, but if they taught that to the general membership, members wouldn't take repentance seriously in this life. Because then they would just logically conclude, well, I can have fun in this life because I can always progress in the next life.
Right. I can kind of see that thinking.
Yeah.
So I definitely don't believe they are speaking for the church officially. These are their ideas, their opinions, and they're trying to find a foundation within Scripture. They quote Book of Mormon, they quote Pro Great Price and Doctrine and Covenants, and other general authorities. Right? They quoted Brigham Young, even Joseph Smith, and various others that in the Fireside. So I think they're trying to find legitimate grounds to offer these ideas with the recognition that it's a little bit off from the.
But to what end? To what end? What do you think? I mean, here's me guessing. My guess is they would hope that, number one, a bunch of members who might feel shame, feel sad about the gospel, would no longer live and dwell in shame. I'm guessing that that's part of their motivation. And then a second part of their motivation is this hope that if enough people talk about it, and I got this phrase from the ATF group, this idea of trickle up theology, that if there's enough scholars and lay members who talk about this stuff, that the general authorities will hear it and start to talk about it more. Because I don't think they're just writing this book and doing these firesides just to pontificate, right?
No, I agree with that. I agree with that totally. And I think they mentioned too that a lot of this stuff is not necessarily official doctrine that they're countering. A lot of it's just deeply embedded in the culture. And you could say that the general authorities and correlation and these manuals are a big driver of that culture of sin, but a lot of that is Protestantism that kind of leaked in, but a lot of it is embedded into culture. And I think they're really trying, like you said, they're trying to change the culture of the church. I think that's their main drive. That
question of what's the difference between doctrine and culture, right, is a huge, no one knows the answer. I would argue there's no such thing as Mormon doctrine, that really there's just a bunch of things said and things written and interpretations over the years. And what's actually officially doctrine, I mean, we don't even know. I'm gonna riff on this idea that Carey advanced about marketplace of ideas. I'm gonna read something that Brittany wrote in our comments, and then I'm gonna talk about Denver Suffer for a bit. So Brittany writes, I think that Fiona and Terryl are very aware that they need to be careful with their image. The second that they are seen as a threat, this is to Carey's point about authority, they will be unable to reach those who need it most. Posturing matters, unfortunately, when it comes to things like apostasy, because they do call out problems in church theology. And in a sense, that was my reaction. They are absolutely contradicting teachings that Boyd K. Packer or, some of the more harsh apostles over the years, Joseph Fielding Smith, I'm sure we could find examples in modern apostles. And really, what we're really talking about is outlined in the Book of Mormon. There's mercy and grace. That's a value in the Book of Mormon. And then there's justice.
Right.
And you really can't ever eliminate both. And so it's always going to be just this tug of war where we're trying to find the right harmony of justice so that people take things seriously and are held accountable, but mercy so that people feel hopeful and don't get too beat down and discouraged. And all they're basically trying to do is kind of put their thumb on the scales of mercy a little bit more so that people feel hopeful and optimistic. But what they have to be careful of is, what's the difference between the Givens and Denver Snuffer? Denver Snuffer is simply just picking interpretations of the Book of Mormon or of things Joseph Smith said and advancing his theology, right? And for him, I guess the difference might be that he's claiming to have direct authority, direct communication with Christ, and that's going to be immediately seen as threatening by the brethren. But he's also encouraging members to gain a lot of individual authority in terms of their relationship with Christ, to kind of cut out the brethren as the middleman between their relationship with Christ and themselves. But what do you guys think about the fact that the Givens need to be careful and that this is sort of dicey business? Scott, we'll have you answer that one first, and then Carey, if you have anything to add.
I don't know about. I'm hopeful that that's not true. Because I feel like it's just hard for me to know, because in my position, my perspective, I feel like what they're offering is well within the broad tent of Mormonism as far as I can see it. Right?
Yeah, I think so too.
I don't think they're really trying, and I think what they're doing fundamentally is different than what I know of Denver Snuffer doing, because they're in the church, they're going, they're I don't know what their callings are, assuming they have callings, they're in their word, they're participating, and they're really they're trying to build up the church itself, right? Yes, we have our individual revelation, we have our individual perspective and opportunities to learn and get these insights, and they're offering theirs, right? They're publishing books, but they're also very loyal, as far as I can tell, to the church, the institution itself. They're really pointing people to the church as well, right? And they're quoting current general authorities. I think they quoted Elder Uchtdorf in the Fireside, and things like that. So they're pointing us to the church, right? And I don't ever see them attacking the church directly. I see them kind of questioning and criticizing the culture, as I said earlier. And maybe you could point out disagreements between what they're saying in specific talks, like you said. Maybe you can point out a quote in President Packer's talk, but they don't call it out directly, right? They're just offering. It's a very positive way of doing it. They're finding quotes in scriptures and general authorities they agree with, and they're pointing everybody that direction.
Yeah, it's very strategic and smart and diplomatic, which to their credit, that's the way you survive. But I think what some of our listeners are saying is they're walking a tightrope a little bit, because they want to try and encourage a different approach to theology, but they have to be careful not to step across lines that make the brethren feel challenged or contradicted. I think that's true. Michael writes that the institutional church isn't denouncing the Givens says something. That's true. The fact that their book is published by Deseret Book says a lot. Right. And the fact that they're allowed to run around and go to various chapels and give these firesides speaks volumes, right?
Right.
So it seems like they're pretty operating on pretty safe territory. My next question is, so recently, Ballard said some things that were kind of really, shook some people up. So he basically made that point that we may be general authorities, but we're not authorities on all things. Mm-hmm. And that we need to find a place for LGBT brothers and sisters. Some looked at those comments as signs of hope. Others said that's doublespeak, that, we're going to have these awful LGBT policies that cause kids to kill themselves, but the church doesn't want to look like they're anti-LGBT. So occasionally they'll make positive LGBT comments, and that way they can sort of speak to both sides of the audience. Carey, what do you think about this idea that the church the brethren are going to keep towing the conservative line, and that's what General Conference is, and in that way they're going to shore up their base. But then as a tactic, they're using the Givenses to go around sort of in private, sort of in this rifle way, to sort of speak to the liberals, speak to the progressives, so that they can sort of have their cake and eat it too. They could be orthodox, they could be fundamentalists, they could be more justice warriors, but at the same time have the Givenses out there to kind of cover the bases and reach out to those who need a different message. And is that bad? What do you think about that, Carey?
That sounds very kind of conspiratorial to me. Like it's too well organized of a thing. You know, I see it more. I see diversity within the upper leadership, except, you know, in certain ways and in policies, you know, they all come together and, you know, I don't know, maybe it's a little bit of all those, maybe all of that can be true at some sense, because it's just something always in motion. I mean, no matter what he said is hopeful, but maybe that hope won't reach the light of day. You know, maybe there'll be somebody else, some other thing that comes along and squashes it. But, you know, as long as you think what he said was honest, you know, he's trying to push it that way. He's trying to build a base or build, you know, momentum and that. And I think there's a lot of things.
You mean Ballard?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
so you're saying that not all the brethren are in agreement. I think we know that's true. I think that the apostles themselves disagree and have different approaches. And then instead of it being viewed in some Machiavellian way where like the brethren are trying to be dishonest, what we're seeing is different apostles or different wings of the church institution sponsoring different approaches, so that in the church there can actually be a diversity of thought and a perspective. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
That's cool. Scott, what would you add?
I tend to agree with that. I think I don't get the sense that the Givens are acting on behest of a direct kind of coordinated effort with the general authorities. I kind of feel like they're, who knows, but I just kind of took it as they're being honest and authentic. And I think Ballard is being honest and authentic. And I think others are being honest and authentic, maybe in ways others don't like. So I think there is probably, I agree. I think there's a lot of diversity of opinion. And I think the church is really trying to work through this in an official way, right? We get these official statements, but, you know, you see the church evolve over time in a lot of different ways. And I think officially you're going to see that
I love it.
Goes on. Yeah.
Let me ask you guys specifically about the Givens' tactics. And this speaks to this issue of Neo-Apologetics. Nick writes, the Givens rationalize and distract from the falsehoods using intellectualism and flowery words. What do you guys think about that? When I read The God Who Weeps, there was a part of me that's like, oh, if we can just quote enough poets and philosophers, we can sort of put lipstick on a pig. And I don't mean that that's my view. I'm just saying that's a point of view. Mm-hmm. When I interviewed Tova Mirvis recently, an ex-Orthodox Jew, she defined apologetics as helping people feel good about things they don't feel good about. And what do you guys think about that argument, that the Givens' tactic is to use Greek, to use French, to use philosophy, to use poetry and literature, just as a way to sort of have these mellifluous words that make us feel better? And in reality, it's just an apologetic approach to make us feel good about something that we maybe shouldn't feel good about. Scott, why don't you start on that one?
Okay. I mean,
is there something to that? Is there nothing to that from your point of view?
There's perhaps there's something to that. And I think though, for me at least, first of all, I love poetry. I love theology. I love academics. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think there's a lot of beauty and depth, and that's what that's what we all should be trying to do, right? Like dig in and really appreciate beauty and poetry and theology. So I think, and this is the Givenses, that's their whole life. Like, that's their career. That's what they do. That's their expertise. So I don't expect anything else from them.
Right.
I also think the church is this mess, like everything, the world, all of its institutions, every individual, we're all messy. We have beauty, we have darkness, we have shadows, we have struggles, we have sin, and we hurt each other in all kinds of ways. I mean, that's just the way life is. And so sure, there's going to be institutions that probably shouldn't exist, and we should shut them down. I don't think the Mormon church is like that. It's just, I think it's sincere and it's trying to do good. And when I read about Joseph Smith's biographies and like Western ruling, that's how I see his life, as these people with who have this inner sense of goodness mostly, and are trying to build things up. And there's all these flaws and rough people in it and doing things that hurts people. I think on the whole, we're just trying to make it better and grow it and make it more closer to the way God would want it to be, right? So that's how I take it. Yeah, so there is pig kind of stuff, and there's lipstick on pig stuff in there, but that's way too simple of a view of what's happening.
You're saying what's wrong with poetry and literature?
Right.
Poetry and literature are awesome.
Right? Exactly. Right.
Why,
right.
What, that's like good stuff. Carey,
Right.
what would you add to anything to what Scott said?
Yeah, so it's like, as opposed to what, it's like, if I quote Billy Corgan, it's like, despite all my rage, I'm still just a rat in a cage. I mean, I have spent years out of the church, from like 21 to 26, listening to, just living a different life. And you still are listening to philosophy, poetry, music, movies, and I mean, that's what we want to say on Mormon Stories, right? Is that you can be atheist, ex-Mormon, all that, and you still have values and ethics, and you live a good life, and you argue for things that matter, women's rights, feminism, all these great things, that we all share, and we're persuaded with those things through the arts and through literature, through the whole thing. And so, how do we ever decide on a message? I guess that's, going back to Christianity, right? That's the fruits. Are these things creating fruits in my life, in the here and the now, that enable me to feel like it's working, right? To feel like this is real and it's not just another iteration of falsehoods. And, I'm constantly, at times going through that, where I learn or I redefine different areas of my life. But yeah, it's kind of been a hard struggle at some times over these last 6-7 years, in particular down this road. But I have found it worth it and illuminating at times. And so, yeah, I'm enjoying the journey.
You're bearing a New Order Mormon testimony, Carey. That's what you're doing. I love it. Megan writes, for me, I listen to the Givens to improve myself, to find a better way to be a Christian, one of love and inclusion. I listen to the GAs for similar messages. When I find messages that don't promote that, I move on. Some GAs do talk with this type of message on grace, doubt, etc., and some don't.
Yeah.
Is that good stuff? You guys like that?
Yep, totally.
Okay. So Kent writes, I do wonder if Neo-Apologetics is a long-term answer for people throughout their lives. I think for many, it's hard for them to straddle the middle of road view of Mormonism for an entire lifetime. It appears that eventually you're all in that church is the one and only, or completely out. You're all in that the church is the one and only, or completely out. Okay, this is great. Carey, I'll ask you then, Scott. So I've been talking forever about this idea of Reformed Judaism, that Judaism had to face modernity and science and literalism and historicity 200 years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years ago. And they came up with Reformed Judaism, which now has become the largest branch of of Judaism, which basically says, I believe in God or don't, believe in Moses or don't, keep kosher or don't, obey the Sabbath or don't. It's more about ritual. It's about community. It's about spirituality. Do you guys think that this sort of emerging New Order Mormonism, New Wave Mormonism, Progressive Mormonism, whatever you want to call it, is it sustainable in the long term for individuals, and is it sustainable within this church as an institution? Carey, what's your reaction? And then Scott, I want to hear yours.
Yeah, I guess I would think it is. I mean, that's part of, you go back to your comments before. We don't have, what is Mormon doctrine? It's kind of hard, right? I mean, that's what was so nice about McConkie and Fielding Smith is like, we could point to it, we could define it, but it gets harder as time goes on, and by not having that systematic kind of it all written down and all defined, when we say, then I think that does open the door for having different understandings and beliefs. I think I remember hearing Patrick Mason talk about the truth cart, not put, and he would put less things in the truth cart versus, and I think that's a lot of things. There probably are some things that are harder to move out of that cart, and they might not ever move out of that cart. To where some people are more uncomfortable with that. So you're going to have to live with a certain tension in that community if you stay, because, it's hard when you have a different interpretation sometimes to coexist and feel like your belief isn't as valid as theirs. So
you're optimistic about New Order Mormonism, Progressive Mormonism.
Yeah, I don't think it, in the end, it has to be Mormonism, right? It's for it to work. And I think that Mormonism itself has enough that can infuse it, and it just feels more what Mormonism is. I mean, a lot of what the Givens talk about, if you went back to your chapel, you said, oh, they were talking about how God is this really great guy. He's not a mean person, right? That's part of their message too. I guess we didn't cover, but if you went and said that God is loving and he doesn't, he's not there to punish you, everybody would just be shaking their heads. But when you start to look at the theology of it and you go, well, actually, the Protestants, they, and they do use some of the quotes of there's some preacher back in the 1800s, 1700s that has like, you're like a spider to God. And
right.
Yeah. So they reference that in their presentation. They have a slide on that.
Right.
And so what they're restoring, or in a sense, is talking about that goes over really well in the church, in the chapel. Except sometimes we muddle our theology so much that the things we're actually talking about agree with this guy. They agree with the damnation one. So they're trying to illuminate, like, no. The restoration means that we have an embodied, we have we're not a fall as an ascent. If we take those doctrines seriously, then we'll have we have better results. But in some ways, people don't have to know theology; they know Heavenly Father is a loving God. So I don't know. In some ways, I could see that the general authorities, they teach God is loving, but then maybe their theology isn't so well defined that they end up contradicting themselves sometimes, Elder Nelson. But, in terms of some of his stuff.
Right. Scott, what's your answer about your bullishness about progressive New Order Mormonism?
I think I want to say I'm optimistic, although I do understand that it's difficult. So there are times at church on Sunday where I just don't feel like it's really tough to kind of really express myself fully and authentically. And I could understand that challenge, but I'm hopeful, and I guess I'm hopefully optimistic that there is. And I really see the Catholicism, what the Catholic Church does, and I'm not an expert on all these different churches, but I see the Catholic Church, they have a pope, they have this correlated Catholicism, but they also have liberalism in Catholicism. There's these different sects and stuff all thriving in the church, and I kind of see that as a model that I hope Mormonism can get to, where you do have a conservative branch and you have a liberal branch, and they're kind of working together, and working off each other, and you still have the authority structure and the hierarchy, which I feel is important for an organization to work. But it holds these two branches in tension. I kind of feel like we used to have that more, because we had Hugh B. Brown and other liberal Mormons in leadership positions, kind of in tension with the more conservative aspect. So for some reason, we've kind of lost some of that. And I feel like it's possible that we'll get that back. I mean, it's hard to know. I could see why people would be negative about it, and I could see why people would be positive about it. I just, the world is complicated. We're all complicated. It's really would be really sad to me if we just kicked out all the liberals from the church. That's just not what any church should be doing. So,
and the fact that all these people like the Givens are getting book contracts with Deseret Book is a
right.
positive sign, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yes. So yeah, and there are, I think, more liberal Mormons in leadership. I think President Uchtdorf and others. So we're all complicated, and we're all learning and growing, and I think So hopefully things.
Let's read a few more comments from our listeners. Kent writes, Bruce R. McConkie took a shot at defining Mormon doctrine and failed. And that's true. The Mormon doctrine is now out of print. So the book that was like, define the Mormonism of my generation has now been mothballed and is out of print. And that really has to be looked at as a rejection by the modern church of Bruce R. McConkie, Joseph Fielding Smith doctrine, right?
And I've heard Terryl at the Fireside. He said, somebody asked him about that, and he said it's not because of lack of sales.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Something that Thomas wrote in that I think is really interesting to mention. He said before Patrick Mason was here in Arizona a week before the Givens. And it's interesting that both Patrick and the Givens are reaching back to the first century Christianity to define the restoration today. And that's kind of a sense that I get, that we're always continually restoring the restoration, and that we're trying to get prior to kind of the Protestant stuff that was more harsh, maybe Calvinism, I don't know, I'm not a historian or a theologist, but we have to reach back to a point of time in Christianity where we can sort of validate the approach that we think is useful. And I'm gonna also read what Tiani writes. What the Givens are doing is very similar to the remnant, meaning Denver Snuffer, as far as some of the theology and reinterpretation of Scripture. But the difference is that the Givenses don't directly challenge the authority structure, whereas the remnant movement does. Yeah. So they're viewed as helping rather than hurting. They toe the line enough to perhaps not get called out on it. That's an interesting point.
Right.
Yeah.
So those are some really good comments from our listeners. Megan writes, the Givens are trying to bring people to Christ without challenging the patriarchal structure. What do you guys think about that? That's, you're always safe if you don't challenge the patriarchy. And is that a good thing? Should they be challenging the patriarchy? Carey, what do you think? Are you a fan of the patriarchy? Are you a fan of the patriarchy, Carey?
No, and I think I'm gonna sound like an apologist, right? Because I feel like a lot of that is going away anyhow to some extent. It's not emphasized. There's a lot of that is being de-emphasized, and that's kind of how Mormonism works, right? We just start to de-emphasize one thing, and it kind of falls out of favor, rather than having this big announcement that we're no longer going to speak of it this way. But you start to see those trends. I mean, seeing Fiona up there and speak and articulate, if we're just talking patriarchy in terms of her as a scholar and as just somebody that you can admire, and you recognize how brilliant and she is up there, is to some extent speaks against the patriarchy when viewed through those kind of old lenses of the males are the ones endowed with all the intelligence and authority of knowing God and those kinds of things. So I mean, I would think Fiona just in herself is a symbol against that.
I have to say, Scott, I want to bring you in, but it's worth noting that Bobby Givens Goetler, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but she writes, for what it's worth, as Terryl and Fiona's sister. I'm guessing she's Terrell's sister, but Fiona's sister-in-law. I can tell you they're absolutely not acting on the directive of the church, either officially or unofficially. So that's fun to have Terrell's sister kind of opine. Scott, what were you going to say about the patriarchy?
Yeah, I think...
Should they be criticizing the patriarchy, or should they be diplomatically working within the patriarchy?
I think we all have our own roles to play. I had a conversation the other day about Richard Rohr, and he was talking about if you really want to challenge, I mean, you really have to be called to really challenge and advocate for a certain cause, especially when you're like the negative, right? If you're really trying to oppose something, you really have to do it with the right spirit. And if the Givens don't feel called to do that, I totally respect what I fully respect what they're doing. I respect what other people are doing who feel called to do otherwise. I think we all have to find our own kind of path. So I definitely am glad that there are people out there challenging the patriarchy. I'll say that. I don't necessarily think the Givens have to be those people.
All right. Tiani writes, I agree that the Givenses are honest and authentic. I think they have truly found some aha gems in their research, and they're excited about it and want to share it. On the church's end, I think the church is happy to allow, quote, expert apologists to help them any way they can get help. As long as the experts don't directly challenge the authority, the church is happy to let scholarly work express some diverse ideas. Tiani, you're awesome. We need to have you on Mormon Stories.
Yes.
There's our woman voice. Call her up. Get her on.
I love it. Tiani, if you want to join us, I will actually literally add you to this conversation. So message me if you want to join us. Other women as well. If Terryl, Bobby, if you want to join us and speak on behalf of the Givenses or on behalf of yourself, just message me on Facebook and I'll add you to this conference call. Really quickly, there was a point that was made again on Facebook where basically the cynical people are like, well, if the brethren are not teaching it, it doesn't matter what the Givens teach. And then somebody else said, well, if it's not in the curriculum, it doesn't matter what the Givens teach. And then Susan wrote, hey, that's our job. Our job is to introduce these ideas into Sunday school, into Sunday lessons. And if we as progressives step up and just start teaching these ideas, they'll get around. Now, I did that for several years in Elders Quorum. I tried to teach progressive lessons, and it was hard. It was hard because a third of the people slept through the lesson. A third of the people loved it, but a third of the people were angry and were annoyed, and you start fostering contention where people are saying, well, Bruce R. McConkie didn't say that, or Elder Ballard didn't say that, and then they start complaining to the bishop and scowling at you whenever you teach your lesson. And this goes to that point about, is the New Order Mormon middle way sort of sustainable? What is it? What are your guys' thoughts on this idea of being the progressive voice at church? Carey, let's have you answer. Have you ever tried to be that progressive voice at church?
Oh, yeah.
And if so, how has that worked out for you?
You know, I have hits and misses, I mean.
But you're doing it. You're saying you're doing it. You're in the struggle.
Oh, yeah.
And what's that like? What's that been like for you? Has it been positive, negative? You like it?
Well, that's what I'm saying. There's areas where I've been really successful with it, and there's areas where I have experienced what you've experienced, a little bit, where, especially Sunday school, I'm not the teacher up there. So, just having the person raising their hand with a alternative viewpoint doesn't always go well. So yeah, there definitely are challenges. I don't know that, I've listened to so many podcasts, and if people have good answers for this, I definitely don't have a better answer than theirs. I just keep at it, and I kind of recognize that's just part of the game. It's part of it's just part of that struggle, and I try to allow people to kind of be wherever they're at. And I push back, though. I'm not afraid to push back and make comments. And sometimes you have to just stand alone. Sometimes you have to be willing to to speak out against your friends, right, on different ideas. And that's when I try to go back to those basic Mormon and Christian principles, that sit there and reward the person with courage. And, Jesus is standing alone against all these things, there's a lot there. And so, I take, I guess, some refuge in that. And
yeah.
No,
that's good.
It's okay.
Scott, how about you?
No, I totally agree. In fact, it was testimony for us because we had a state conference the week before, and I got up and bore my testimony, and it was all about what the Fireside. I gave testimony of a Christ who heals and a God who mourns and a Holy Ghost, a Spirit who comforts, and that we are all broken, right? And that was my testimony, and I didn't get any pushback because, like I said, that's very in the mix. So there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of in the core theology. There's a lot of progressive, compassionate. And so there's a way to word and phrase things in a way that just, that doesn't directly make people feel, because you want to be able to speak the language, right? You mean the goal in church is to connect with people. So rather than always challenge, you want to find connection, and then in the connection, I can grow, I can learn from others, and they can hopefully learn from me. And I try to do that. Lately, I've been, it's hard sometimes in Sunday school because sometimes I'm the person sleeping or just reading my own stuff because it's so hard sometimes to stay engaged. But I definitely, that is a challenge I try to take on, is just kind of being a voice and sharing other points of view in ways that lead more kind of breadth to the conversation, for sure.
I love it. What about people that say that the church needs to be more accountable, that apologists are used in a way as a shield to keep the church from just saying, look, we've taught harmful stuff, we've taught wrong stuff, and we apologize. We're taught the steps of repentance, and Downey Chokes is on record as saying we don't apologize. And yet many people, I think, this topic of apologetics and neo-apologetics really strikes a chord with people. And a lot of people who have left the church get really triggered by all this. And I think it's at least partly because they want to see some accountability. They want to see the church make restitution, apologize, make restitution. And apologists maybe sometimes are seen as a shield to keep the church from being accountable. What do you guys think about that feeling that many sort of post-Mormons have? Can you empathize with it at all?
Oh yeah, I mean, I have those feelings myself at times. I've gone through, and I get frustrated. There's a certain type of apologist that just is like nails on a chalkboard for me too. When, at least for me, the apologist that has to just toe the party line, whatever that's kind of been traditionally thought of, that's what their arguments are. And I think that's the negative kind of apologist. And perhaps everybody from time to time is that apologist, but the neo-apologists I think you're talking about are ones that are willing to say, there were things done in the past that this isn't right and this wasn't here, but I think they still come at it with love, with an understanding and with forgiveness for that person. And I think that's what that's to me. I see that modeled in Terryl Gibbons. At times where he's able to criticize or critique, different theologies, doctrines, practices, maybe both modern or past. But he does it in a way that he still puts forward his support of the brethren, of the church, of the institution, and so that is what allows him to succeed. I don't know what it's going to take for the institution as a church to be like that. I mean, I get frustrated many times and still feel that way. I wish they do this, and I have a hard time with everything that takes place, So.
Sure. All right, Scott, what's your answer to that?
Yeah, I just don't see the Neo-Apologists really. They're really speaking for themselves. I don't think there's a coordinated kind of that they represent the church in any sort of way. So I think,
but that's true. But some would say they're being used, and so the bigger question is, can you empathize with the idea that it's that before we can have these nuanced approaches, that the church leaders themselves need to sort of acknowledge their own mistakes, their own accountability, their own diminished status. And in some sense, that's what Ballard did last week when he said, when Ballard said, I may be general authority, but I'm not an authority of all things in general.
Yeah.
Because if the brethren would just say, hey, we're all trying our best, we all make mistakes, we're all just giving our best opinions. Sometimes we get it wrong. We've gotten it wrong in the past sometimes. Sometimes it's really hurt people. We're sorry. We're going to try and do better. Work with us here. Right. That's kind of what a lot of people are looking for.
I agree. I think a lot of the ways the church is hard for people would be a lot easier to take if they just did that. I think that's at core. When they project themselves as not only official leaders of the church, but these like people on the pedestal, can do no wrong, speak for God, everything they say is exactly from God, right? When that's the notion that's projected, that's the way I view them. That makes everything so much harder. Then you have to like try to figure out, okay, how is polygamy from God? How is blacks in the priesthood from God? If we could just admit, hey, we just made some mistakes, we got this wrong, right? It just eases the whole experience for everybody, right? So I
don't know if it does it for everybody, Scott. Right? It's like then all of a sudden you're like, well, wait a minute, what is true? What is the right? I thought I would join this church and they were going to tell me, and it was all. I mean, then you're disillusioned, and
you're right.
It opens a whole nother can of worms.
You're right. It's tough. No, I sympathize with the people who want that. I also sympathize with the church who maybe some of them would like to do that, but
and so I think what we're seeing is that this process is messy and it takes time, right?
Right.
And what we're seeing is what we're living in 2017 with the Givens, with the Bushmans, with Patrick Mason, with Ballard, with Oakes, is we're just living the messiness of the time it takes for a church to become more diverse and more mature.
Right.
And I guess we could say kudos to the Givens and the Masons and, the Colvins and the Witherspoons and the Turleys and the Foushees. I don't remember how to pronounce your name, Terry. Kudos to everyone who's in that conversation.
Yes.
All right, I'm going to give Carey, I'll give you a final word, and then Scott, I'll give you the last word. We'll wrap up.
Okay.
What would you like to sort of say in closing as we sort of look on, as you've experienced one of the Givens Firesides, as we look at the Christ Who Heals, as we look at the role of Neo-Apologetics, what summary do you want to leave our listeners with in this episode?
Man, that's hard. Mine goes blank thinking like that, but I still just struck by how little there were of people there. That's kind of what I feel like too. Is like I do a lot of this. I'm reading these books, I'm thinking all these things, and for the most part, I don't have a lot of people to even talk about religion with. People at church aren't really interested in talking about those kinds of things. I've kind of grown to accept that and appreciate that. My own wife, she would rather just, go to church on Sunday and most of the time, and then just basically she's orientated by the gospel. She lives her life, and we kind of live those ways, but she just doesn't really care about the details. Like, in a lot of ways, she'll let me talk to her a little bit, express this and that, but she's just out of complete non-interest in theology and all these details of religion in general. And I get that. And then I think in some ways, there's only certain people that are going to be that interested in these differences. So in that way, I'm a little more pessimistic about these things actually mattering in terms of, lots of people getting involved, because I think that there's just not that many people that really care about those details until you have to. And then, being in these online communities of Mormon Stories and Mormon Matters and all the ATF and all those is, there's always people that have a hard time with because I know I'm going to sound like an apologist to them, is because the brethren don't sanction this. And that's always the stopper is, they just don't feel like it's legitimate. And I don't know how I got there, but I did. I just got to where I didn't need that external authority approval. That's sort of what I ended up learning is I didn't need that. I don't necessarily need them to still be able to feel Mormon and feel genuinely and grow. There's still tension in dealing with that and the when I go to church and stuff like that. But that's why I go to the Givens. That's why I read these books, is because I'm still, working on it. And I'll leave you with that.
I love it. All right, Carey, you've been great. Thanks for joining us. Scott, you get the final word.
All right. I just want to say too that I think this goes way beyond just Mormonism, because I had a recent conversation about Richard Rohr. I kind of feel like he's doing the same thing from a Catholic point of view, and I just think there's these thinkers and out there just broadly, theologians and in all different faiths, and there's others too that I need to dive into. And they're saying a lot of the same things about compassion and connection and wholeness and bigness, right? And I just find it beautiful and poetic and big. And I while at the same time I do agree we need standards and boundaries, and we don't want to be total messes, right? We want to have these lives that are good and stuff. So I find it really beautiful and so much light here, and I love being here, and I wish there was more of it, as Carey was saying. But I just to me it's just a beautiful thing, and I can't wait to buy the book and to read it and dig into it. And there's a whole stack of other books I want to read and dig into and bring it into my lived experience and in my conversations with people in church on Sunday as well. So no, it's great stuff, and I love talking about it. So appreciate you having me on.
In some way, you guys at A Thoughtful Faith are kind of carriers and spreaders of the light, right? You're trying to just say, let's have more light, let's have more love, and let's find a way to spread it. Even though it's just scratching the surface, it's a couple thousand people, really, right?
Right. Yeah.
But that's a start, and it's a real act of love that you guys are sort of engaging in, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I hope so.
So shout out to you, Scott, to you, Carey, to all the good people at A Thoughtful Faith, to the Givens and the Bushmans and the Masons and all those guys.
Yes.
I really liked our conversation. So Scott and Carey, you're awesome. Thanks for joining us. Please, let's get some women on these discussions. That's an open invitation. We would love to have more women. So love you guys. Thanks so much. Thanks to all the listeners. Definitely our Facebook Live participants made this conversation more meaningful. So thanks to everyone who participated. For those who support the Open Stories Foundation, A Thoughtful Faith Podcast, Mormon Matters Podcast, Mormon Stories Podcast, we can't do this without you. So please do support us if you can. Just go up to your favorite podcast, go to the top right, click on donate, in 10, 15, $100 a month, whatever you can afford. Allows us to keep paying Gina, allows us to keep paying Dan, allows us to keep the lights on with the Open Stories Foundation staff. And it makes a big difference. Thanks to all the moderators of A Thoughtful Faith Forum for keeping that forum so awesome. And please join us again soon. In just a few minutes, I'm going to be interviewing Weird Alma, which is actually a gentleman named Eric Herman, who has written some parodies about Mormonism that are really funny in the style of Weird Al Yankovic. So stay tuned if you want to hear about that. We'll be starting that in just a few minutes. But thanks to everyone for joining us. Thanks for the support, and we'll see you guys again soon.